answer the question. I knew that Blair would lead to a very negative set of developments in Labour politics, but even I didn't imagine for a minute that they would be as negative and bloody as they turned out to be, because he was essentially inventing, as indeed the Irish Labour Party and other socialist parties like the French followed down this path of what they called a third way, which actually turned out to be just the first way. If the first way was neoliberal economics, neocon foreign policy, and the second way was communism, they said they had a third way. But in fact, they became neoliberal in economics and neoconservative in foreign policy, and I could see that that was coming. What I didn't quite envisage was what Matthew Norman called this messianic property, which Blair very definitely had. And I saw it. Claire Shaw didn't acknowledge it because she couldn't really, because she supported the Yugoslav war. But I saw it at the time of the Yugoslav war, which of course was sold to us, if those of you who can remember it, was sold to us on exactly the same raft of hypocrisy that the Iraq war was. That there was an aggressor, that there was the new Hitler in the form of Milosevic, and that there was a new set of victims, in this case the Kosovans, that they must be allowed to return to their homes, not something he ever envisaged for Palestinian people, unfortunately, who've been driven out of their homes for 60 or more years. But that was, for me, the template, that, and I was sure that it would pave the way to further invasions on the, you see, in the old empire days, the British Empire and other empires used to wear the cloak of religion, the cloak of civilization. These are inferior people, we have to hold their hand and lead them to a better way. This was superseded in the Blair era with liberal humanitarian intervention. And you still hear it today. You heard it in Libya, you hear it today in Syria. There's a humanitarian disaster, something must be done. We have the right and obligation to do it, so we must invade, topple the government, change the system, regime change. And that developed around the time of the Yugoslav war. In fact, a concept called RTP, Right to Protect, was theorized by Blair and Clinton as a kind of, basically a new law that national sovereignty hereafter had no value. It could be superseded at any time. We could intervene in any country, of course highly selectively. We intervened in Iraq, but not Saudi Arabia. Highly selective view on human rights and humanitarian crises. And they theorized it. Indeed, Mr. Cooper, who was Mr. Blair's chief foreign policy advisor, he actually published a pamphlet called The New Imperialism, and he meant it as a compliment. He said that we should shake ourselves of the notion that imperialism is a bad thing, that sometimes there are places where more developed countries need to intervene and regime change and remodel less developed countries. So all of that I kind of saw coming. I just didn't see how big it would be. If you think about it, the Blair-Bush war has now cost not just the 1 million lives in Iraq, but it's caused the death of 250,000 people in Syria, tens of thousands of people in Libya, and Libya is now broken into 3 countries with 4 prime ministers. no army, total breakdown of the state, and they didn't go on to the other countries that Wesley Clark talked about. They haven't yet invaded Iran because they found it too tough a nut to crack, but they've caused a tremendous amount of suffering in Iran over all these years of sanctions and so on. So nobody should underestimate the scale of the disaster, the crime, the blunder that this has all represented. And we haven't seen the end of the story by any means. This ISIS, Al-Qaeda phenomenon is the greatest, I think, existential danger in the world today, even greater than colonialism, because it contains within it the power to destroy societies everywhere. It has captured a zeitgeist amongst a section of the Muslim population in the world. Furious, anger, bitter at what they see as Western injustice and the Al-Qaeda, ISIS mindset posing as an alternative. And this fanaticism is everywhere. I mean, it could even be here in Galway. It's certainly true in many parts of my own country.
Yeah. Hi, George. Do you keep it short? Do you actually think Tony Blair will be before the Hague for war crimes? Or do you think it'll just be brushed under the carpet, same as everything else?
Well, only black people have been tried at the ICC so far. I'm not making that up. Every single person who's been prosecuted at the ICC in The Hague has been a black African. So he's the wrong colour for The Hague. But no, Milosevic was in the Yugoslav War Crimes Tribunal. That wasn't the ICC. The ICC has only tried and convicted black African leaders. Small tyrants.
Yeah, so how come Mugabe hasn't been done it?
Well, they never managed to capture him. And he's very, very old. He'll probably die before they can do that. So the Hague might be a stretch, although we're trying. And you saw Michael Mansfield QC on the film give something of the shape of what a case could be. You can't try him for the war itself, because that was not a crime under the statutes of the ICC at the time that they did it. But torture is a war crime, and was in the statutes of the ICC. The use of banned weapons, like depleted uranium, white phosphorus, they were crimes at the time and can be used. But you need a state to bring a case to the ICC. Now, in the past, people thought, who's going to bring a case against America or against Britain? But it's quickly developing that there may very well be such states. If I was advising the president of Russia, for example, I'd say, well, they're always getting after you. Why don't you get after them? Why don't you bring a case at the ICC against Tony Blair? In fact, if he's listening, let me give that advice to the president of Russia. There are other countries, Iraq itself, Syria itself, Iran. There are other countries that could bring such a case to the ICC. What I can tell you is this. Blair is going to be seeing the inside of a lot of courtrooms over the next months and years, because there are hundreds of British families whose sons, husbands, were needlessly sacrificed in this illegal war. And
could that be possibly why he closed a lot of his companies
it's partly that, although the bad news for the British taxpayer is that David Cameron has already said Britain will pay for the defence of Tony Blair in all these cases. But there are potentially hundreds of them. And I'm fundraising now to help the families bring these civil cases. And the Chilcot report will be the evidence on which these cases will be brought. And there will be potentially hundreds of these actions. And Blair will have to appear in front of every single one of
It
those.
won't cost him a dime.
Won't cost him a dime, except it's going to be a pretty grueling process for him. I don't believe that Corbyn is going to capitulate. I believe that he's going to press on. And then the question is, what will the Blairites do? Will they have the courage to break away and form their own party? Will they try and form a party inside Parliament? Will they continue this fifth column inside the Parliamentary Labour Party, still taking the Labour name, but undermining the leadership at every turn? These questions will be answered in the next few weeks, I suspect. But Jeremy Corbyn is a good and honest man. I've known him for 40 years. He's been right about everything. The BBC have just exhumed a 21-year-old interview that he gave defending his invitation to Gerry Adams to come to the British Parliament. It's funny, they could never find Jimmy Savile, but they found this interview. 21 years old, and they put it up on their website. But anyone with half a brain would say, well, he was right about that, wasn't he? In the end, they all did that. Germany was just ahead of the curve, ahead of his time. He was right about Ireland, he was right about Iraq, he was right about Libya, right about Syria, right about austerity. He was right about everything. And that's the message that we'll be trying to get across to the British public over the next 4 years.
Before anybody else asks the question, I would just like to make 1 or 2 points. And I know you don't really want to listen to me, but and I understand that perfectly. But when you watch what happened there, what we saw on the screen tonight of the use of white phosphorus in Fallujah in Iraq, the slaughter of Iraq, the torture that has taken place, the rendition that has happened. The reality is, if Tony Blair is a mass murderer, we, the Irish people, via Shannon, are accessories to mass murder, which is the same thing. And I think that is something we have got to get into our heads, that day and daily US military travel through Shannon and they bring weapons of mass destruction, they bring troops, millions of troops, and this is going on and we should stop it. And one of the reasons that we have organised tonight's event and why we had a former SAS soldier speaking only 2 weeks ago is to raise the issue of the 15th anniversary of the war in Afghanistan, or the war on terror, where we have been complicit right through for the last 15 years, and we're organising a bus to go there to Shannon on the 9th, Sunday the 9th of October, and if people are interested in going with us, we will be taking names outside in the foyer, and also €10 for the bus. The other thing that we're selling is a pamphlet, €5, to do with Shannon. But I think when you hear about the deaths in Iraq, in Libya, in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, in Somalia, in Mali, in Syria, think Ireland's involvement. That's all I would ask.
Can I just, I think that's a drop in the
There we are. All right.
What you just said about Shannon Airport and all the rest of it, it's just a drop in the ocean compared to what's going on.
Yeah, but we're
plugging your own thing there.
No, hold on a second. We're in Ireland. We have got to do something about what is happening in Ireland.
It's not to do with it.
Beg your pardon?
You're plugging something that's got absolutely nothing to do with it.
No, it has everything to do with it, because the army, the American army transits through Shannon
So what?
on its way to the wars. I'll tell you so what, because Ireland's constitution requires it to be neutral, and therefore the constitution is being broken every single day at Shannon Airport, just an hour drive from here. That's of some importance.
All right.
To you. Yes, is that someone at the back? Yes, go ahead, please.
First of all, thank you for a very informative documentary in relation to actually what the Tony Blair legacy was about. But what I would actually like to ask you specifically, parking everything to do with individualities and egos and complacency, why was the media backing for so long?
Well, that's a very good question. In a way, like the camel is difficult to define, it's easy to recognize. The answer to your question is difficult to define, but easy to see. The corporate ownership of our media, of most of our media, and the state ownership of the remaining parts of it, their interests coincide. If we look at the British state, for example, the BBC is a state broadcaster, just like RT, just like RTE, and it reflects the priorities and the sense of direction of what you might call the deep state, i.e. not the here today, gone tomorrow governments, but the interests of the deep state. And the interests of the British deep state are to follow the United States wherever it wants to go. It is to defend the interests of NATO, of which we are a founding member and indispensable part. And these fundamental truths drive the state broadcaster. The private owners are a collection, a very small collection. You could fit them into the lavatory in this theatre. The other owners of the British media, there are so few of them. In fact, the lavatory might be the best place for them. You could fit them into the lavatory, but they all have one thing in common, or several things in common. They're tax avoiders, living in a different jurisdiction from the place that they are applying their media trade in. Some of them own Channel Islands, whole islands. Some of them are domiciled in Monte Carlo. Some of them domiciled in the United States and headquartered in states where there's no corporate taxation. I know that's a sore point here in Ireland at the moment. No corporate taxation of any kind. Second thing they have in common is that they are all supporters of the neoliberal economic system and the neoconservative foreign policy view of the world. So you have a conflation of the deep state interests of Britain and the private ideological and economic beliefs of the private owners, and therefore you get, it's not even stereo, it's whatever the singular of stereo is, mono. You have a mono media culture in Britain, so that when the drums start beating, you heard Dr. Ramadani say it on the film, when it all starts up in full force, it is a sight to behold. I mean, I was right in the middle of it. I mean, I would appear on TV in those days and be treated as if I was mad or bad or both. Me and a few others were trapped in the middle of this quite terrifying crescendo of propaganda. And it was very, very difficult to stand up to it. And ultimately it prevailed. Even though before people knew what they know now, millions were against it. If you think about that, at that time, everybody believed that there must be weapons of mass destruction. Otherwise, how could our state be going on and on and on with such volume about it? When we learned that there were no weapons of mass destruction, that's where the feeling of betrayal comes in, even if it's incoherent. It might not be properly worked out by people, but they now know that they're led by liars. They now know that they're led by people capable of saying and doing anything at all. And that's the point I made at the beginning, before the film, about the bankruptcy of the political class. We have a media, a mainstream media, and here's the good news, less and less people now, since the war. Don't forget that the war was in 2003. That seems like a short time ago. But in terms of the development of technology and media, it is an eon ago. There's very little film footage of the great anti-war demonstrations because there were no mobile phones then. Nobody had an iPhone, a smartphone. Nobody could take film. If this was happening today, there would be 100,000 videos that we could have chosen from for that movie there. So that's one of the big positive developments, that now we are the media, if we want to be. We can find the truth wherever we want to look for it. We can find our own truth. Ignorance is a choice now. All of us have the means on our own computers, even our own telephones, to find out what's really happening. That wasn't the case even in 2003. Never mind 93, 83, 73. Now we've got a plethora of different television channels, radio stations, podcasts, vlogcasts. We've got the means of communicating. We're filming this discussion now. I have 1 million followers on social media. 1 million. On Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and all the others. So this will go to 1 million people. They might not all watch it. They won't all watch it. But many tens, scores of thousands will watch it. I hope we can cut out that nutter in front of you. Get the wrong impression of Galway. Although he was going for a train, so he's obviously not from here. So the point I'm making is, the bad news is the wicked nature of our mass media that we have. The good news is fewer and fewer people are paying attention to it. I don't know how bad RTE is. I'm guessing it's as bad as the BBC. But I never watch the BBC. I have to say that because I refuse to pay my license fee and would otherwise go to prison. But I don't, because it is no longer worth watching for me. And there are millions of people like me who no longer buy the right-wing newspapers. We might read them online for free, but we would never dream of going to a shop and buying them. We don't buy what we see and hear in the mainstream media. So for you as a young woman, by the time you're my age, this whole media landscape will be completely different. And our children will hardly watch. In fact, television as we know it, my youngest child is as yet unborn, but my 2-year-old will grow up in a world where the TV channels we know will no longer exist, because TV and film and so on will be completely overhauled.
Another question.
Yeah.
You spent this evening educating us about the damage that Tony Blair has caused, I presume to help prevent it from happening in the future. So my question is, this evening, do you have any practical advice you can offer to people in this room as to how they might go about preventing that in the future?
Well, if I was in Britain, I would give a series of things that I would like people to do, respectful of your independence. So I won't presume to tell you what you should do about your own political class, but I do believe that your own political class is not better than ours. And in some respects, it's just that it's not able to do the same amount of damage in the world for a variety of reasons, neutrality, size, and so on. What I think is vital for us as fellow citizens of what are supposed to be democracies, is that in our case, there are no checks and balances. The British have no constitution. They have no Bill of Rights. And even in my 30 years in Parliament, it was a commonplace to believe that we didn't need one because traditional British common sense would prevail. Nobody could go too far. You saw in the film the Honourable Ambassador Craig Murray tell you that the head of the British Foreign Office said to him, when asked about weapons of mass destruction, of course not, it's bollocks. Imagine if the head of the British Foreign Office had said that publicly at the time. There would have been no war. At least we would not have been in it, and it might have been that there would be no war. Claire Short, if she'd said then on the floor of the House of Commons and resigned with Robin Cook and said it, 2 cabinet departures, both saying that, might actually have changed the vote in the House of Commons. So, in our case, I think you have more checks and balances, but in our case, it's vital that Britain has a constitution. It's vital that we have clearly demarcated powers and restraint on powers that we don't have at the moment. I believe now, I didn't think this through for many years after the war, but I now believe that there was a kind of Bonapartist seizure of power in Britain, where the state was taken by the throat by a small group of zealots around Blair, and all norms of British constitutional life were effectively suspended. The civil service was silenced, the Foreign Office overruled, the security services bent to the interests of a government, whereas it's supposed to represent the deep state continuity, it, for that period, was effectively seized. And I think a lot of them think that too, and that's reflected in the Chilcock Inquiry report. You hear all kinds of mandarins saying things that if they'd said them back then, would have made a really big difference.